For decades, Princess Diana's family history seemed almost perfectly suited to the world she was born into. Aristocratic titles, British estates, royal connections, and generations of powerful families surrounded her maternal ancestry. But hidden inside that family tree was a story that stretched far beyond Britain, and modern genetic research eventually gave historians and genealogists a remarkable new clue about where one branch of Diana's maternal line really came from. The discovery was not about Diana's royal status, and it did not prove that she herself had some completely unknown identity. Instead, it concerned something much more specific: her direct maternal line, the unbroken chain of mothers passing mitochondrial DNA from one generation to the next. And that chain eventually led researchers to a woman named Eliza Kawark, who lived in India in the late 18th and early 19th century. For years, Eliza had often been described in family histories as Armenian. Her surname and her historical connection to the British community in India contributed to that assumption. But when genetic genealogy was brought into the story, the old explanation suddenly became much harder to accept. The trail begins with Diana's mother, Frances Ruth Roche, later known as Frances Shand Kydd. Frances was born in 1936 into the Roche family and became Diana's mother after marrying John Spencer, the future 8th Earl Spencer. Frances herself had an extraordinary family background. Her mother was Ruth Sylvia Gill, better known as Ruth Roche, Baroness Fermoy. Ruth was a Scottish-born aristocrat who became a lady-in-waiting and close associate of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. That connection placed Diana's maternal family surprisingly close to the British royal household long before Diana married Charles. But Ruth was not the end of the story. Go one generation further back, and the family tree takes a dramatic turn. Diana's maternal great-grandmother was Frances Ellen Work, an American heiress from New York. She married James Roche, who later became the 3rd Baron Fermoy. Their descendants eventually included Diana's mother, Frances. Contemporary reporting from 1981 already highlighted Diana's American ancestry through Frances' work. Yet the truly unusual discovery was even farther back. Genealogists tracing the direct female line eventually reached Eliza Kawark, a woman who lived in India around the time of British East India Company rule. Historical records connected Eliza to Theodore Forbes, a Scottish man who worked in India. Their descendants eventually formed the uninterrupted maternal chain leading to Diana. The question was simple but extraordinarily difficult. Who exactly was Eliza Kawark? For generations, the answer was commonly given as Armenian. But there was a problem. The historical evidence was not strong enough to establish that Eliza herself was Armenian, and researchers began wondering whether the traditional description had been wrong. That is where DNA entered the story. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is particularly useful for tracing a direct maternal line because it is passed from mothers to their children. A daughter can pass it to her children, and her daughter can pass it onward again. Because of that inheritance pattern, scientists can sometimes use mtDNA to investigate maternal ancestry across many generations. Researchers working with genetic genealogy traced living descendants connected to Eliza's direct maternal line. According to reporting on the research, samples from 2 living descendants were tested, and the mitochondrial evidence pointed toward a rare haplogroup known as R30b. And this was where the story became extraordinary. The genetic evidence was consistent with South Asian ancestry. Sky News reported that researchers tested 2 living direct descendants connected to Eliza and found additional genetic evidence supporting Indian ancestry. The 2 descendants were reported to have approximately 0.3% and 0.8% South Asian DNA, respectively, alongside predominantly European ancestry. That mattered because the DNA evidence was not being used simply to create a dramatic family tree headline. It was being used to question an assumption that had survived for generations. The old story suggested an Armenian background. The genetic evidence suggested something different. And suddenly, a woman who had been sitting quietly inside an aristocratic family tree became one of the most fascinating ancestors connected to Princess Diana. But there is an important detail that often gets lost when this story is retold online. The DNA does not prove every detail of Eliza Cowork's identity. It does not provide a complete biography of her. It does not tell us exactly what she looked like, what language she spoke, or precisely where her ancestors lived. And it certainly does not mean that Princess Diana was secretly something other than British. What it does provide is a genetic clue about the ancestry carried through this particular maternal line. That distinction is crucial. Diana's family history was already remarkably international. Her maternal side contained British, Scottish, Irish, American, and South Asian connections. Genealogical research has documented the American ancestry through Frances' work, while Diana's maternal grandmother Ruth Roche came from a Scottish family. But Eliza's story is different because it connects that aristocratic family tree to colonial India. And it raises an even more fascinating question. How did a woman living in India nearly 2 centuries ago become an ancestor of one of the most famous women in modern history? To understand that, you have to follow the women. Eliza's descendants continued through the female line, eventually reaching Ruth Gill, then Frances Roche, then Diana. That means the mitochondrial DNA associated with Eliza traveled through generations of women until it reached Princess Diana. And because Diana had 2 sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, the genetic story becomes even more interesting. Diana could pass her mitochondrial DNA to both of her sons because mothers pass mtDNA to their children. But William and Harry cannot pass that mitochondrial DNA to their own children. That is because mitochondrial DNA follows the maternal inheritance pathway. A male inherits mitochondrial DNA from his mother, but normally does not transmit it to his children. So the particular maternal genetic line connected to Eliza continued through Diana into William and Harry. But its transmission ends with them as carriers in terms of passing it onward. That was one reason the research attracted so much attention. Sky News reported that scientists believed Prince William carried Eliza's mitochondrial DNA and that future generations could continue to inherit South Asian ancestry through the broader family tree, although the specific mitochondrial line itself follows maternal inheritance. And there was something else remarkable about this discovery. It challenged the idea that aristocratic family trees are somehow genetically simple. The British aristocracy often looks, on paper, like an isolated world of ancient estates and noble surnames. But DNA tells a different story. People moved. Families crossed borders. Relationships formed between cultures. Children were born far away from the countries their descendants would eventually call home. And sometimes, those connections remained hidden in family records for generations. Princess Diana's story is a perfect example. Before she became the Princess of Wales, she was Lady Diana Spencer, born in 1961 at Park House near Sandringham. Her mother came from the Roche family, while her father belonged to the Spencer aristocracy. Diana's parents married in 1954, and their wedding was attended by members of the British royal family. Nothing about the public image of the Spencer family suggested that one of Diana's direct maternal ancestors would eventually become the focus of a genetic investigation involving India. Yet that is exactly what happened. And perhaps the strangest part is that Diana herself never lived to see the genetic research that brought Eliza Cowork's ancestry back into the spotlight. Diana died in Paris in 1997. The genetic investigation that received widespread attention came more than a decade later. So the woman whose ancestry had been quietly questioned and re-examined was not around to hear the answer. That makes the story feel almost surreal. A princess whose life was constantly examined by newspapers, photographers, historians, and millions of admirers still had parts of her family history that remained uncertain. And one of those mysteries existed in a woman who lived generations before Diana was born. The discovery also demonstrates why genealogy can be so complicated. Family stories are not always scientific facts. A surname can suggest an origin without proving it. A family tradition can survive for a century without being completely accurate. And historical descriptions can reflect assumptions made by people who lived long before modern genetic testing existed. In Eliza Cowork's case, the Armenian explanation appears to have been influenced partly by her name and circumstances. Researchers wondered why an apparently Armenian woman would have been living in Bombay, and whether another explanation made more sense. Genetic evidence then provided an independent clue pointing toward South Asian ancestry. That does not erase the historical possibility of Armenian ancestry elsewhere in the family. In fact, some reporting noted that Eliza's father may have had Armenian ancestry. But that is different from claiming that Eliza herself was definitively Armenian. And that distinction is exactly why the DNA story is so fascinating. It did not simply reveal a secret nationality. It forced researchers to reconsider a centuries-old assumption. There is also an emotional irony to the story. Princess Diana became famous partly because she seemed to connect with people outside the traditional royal world. She was photographed visiting hospitals, meeting people affected by poverty, speaking with children, and publicly embracing causes that sometimes made the establishment uncomfortable. Yet hidden within her own ancestry was evidence of a family connection to a part of the world that British imperial history had profoundly shaped. The discovery did not change who Diana was. It simply added another layer to her story. And that may be the most important lesson from the entire investigation. DNA doesn't care about titles. It doesn't recognize aristocracy. It doesn't know whether someone is a princess, a commoner, a billionaire, or a factory worker. It simply carries biological information from one generation to the next. And sometimes that information reveals a past that written records failed to capture. Princess Diana spent much of her life under intense public scrutiny. Her marriage was analyzed. Her clothing was analyzed. Her friendships were analyzed. Her children were analyzed. Even her facial expressions became newspaper headlines. But one of the most surprising pieces of information about her emerged only after her death, buried not in a palace archive, but inside the genetic material passed down through generations of women. From Eliza Kawark in India, to her descendants, to Ruth Gill, to Frances Roche, and finally to Diana, a line of mothers quietly carried a genetic signature across almost 2 centuries. And when scientists finally followed that trail, they found something that did not fit neatly into the traditional version of Diana's family history. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden royal title, not proof of some sensational internet rumor. Something far more interesting, a forgotten South Asian connection inside the maternal ancestry of one of the most famous women in British history. And perhaps that is why this discovery continues to fascinate people. Because Princess Diana was often portrayed as the ultimate British princess. But her DNA tells us that even the most famous family trees are far more complicated than the names and titles written on them. Her story crossed Britain, Scotland, Ireland, America, and India. And somewhere in that extraordinary journey was a woman named Eliza Kawark, whose place in history might have remained almost completely forgotten if scientists had never decided to follow the DNA. The princess may be gone. The photographs may have faded. The headlines may have changed. But the genetic trail remains. And sometimes the smallest biological clue can completely change the way we understand